The name Elizabeth Van Zyl may not mean too much to you, but her photograph shocked the British public at the turn of the 20th century. Elizabeth died at the Bloemfontein concentration camp, aged only 7 years old. She was an inmate along with her mother, given little food and care, because her father had not yet surrendered to the British and was still fighting as a guerrilla fighter. To understand how Lizzie and the other 26,000 Boers and an unrecorded but an estimated 20,000 Africans met their fate, we must first start at the outset of the Second Boer War. The Boers were Dutch-speaking Afrikaans who left the Cape Colonies following the British Empire's expansion. Republics were formed during the late 19th century, but the key players for our story are the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. As you may be aware, the area of modern-day South Africa is rich in gold and diamonds. This drew the attention of many foreign prospectors or Uitlanders looking to make their fortune. An Uitlander was an immigrant who was living in the South African states, who were predominantly British. The question then arose whether these Uitlanders would be able to vote in the Boer republics, or whether they should be shut out to avoid these newcomers outnumbering the Boers. It was no secret that the British Empire had desires to unify the region under their direct control, and so there was certainly resistance in giving the Uitlander the same rights. Negotiations at Bloemfontein about the rights of the Uitlanders failed, as the British required them to obtain approval from British Parliament for any laws the republics wished to pass. This, of course, naturally failed. By the 5th of June 1899, negotiations were over, and by October, the Second Boer War had begun. A number of preemptive strikes made by the Boers damaged the British infrastructure by a largely mobile mounted force levied from the population as a militia rather than a standing army. The momentum of the Boers stalled as they lay siege to a number of cities, buying the British time to muster a response. In 1900, a force of some 180,000 British soldiers were sent to the conflict. The Boers' fortune faded as around 28,000 prisoners of war were rounded up, and the Boer leadership fled into neighbouring modern-day Mozambique. The remaining soldiers were offered to lay down their arms, and in exchange, they could return to their farms and homes. Those that took up the offer became known as the protected burghers. Of the 28,000 prisoners of war, some 26,000 were sent overseas, as far afield as Bermuda, St. Helena, or India. By late 1900, Britain had control of both republics and ought to have brought an end to the conflict. However, the Boers reorganised and mounted guerrilla strikes on British troops, communications and supplies. One of the most horrific tactics employed by the British was overseen by Lord Kitchener, and it was known as scorched earth. The Boer guerrilla forces could melt back into the civilian population and strike again and again. It did not matter that Britain had committed over 400,000 men to fight, when there were 20-odd thousand Bitterenders willing to fight to the last man. The British response to any attack on them was to destroy one single farm in retaliation. This is what was known as scorched earth. This then escalated to destroying every farm within a 16-kilometre radius in exchange for a single attack. That was then scrapped by Lord Kitchener, who did away with the requirement for an attack at all, and began the wholesale destruction of all farms and homesteads. Combined with the forcible placement of Boer women and children in these camps, black Africans were forced into the camps as forced labourers, as to fuel the British war effort and rob the Boers of their farm workers. This policy led to many more refugees being displaced. Refugee camps that were built to house the protected burghers were transformed into concentration camps under the supervision of Lord Kitchener. A total of 45 tented camps were established to house the Boers and 66 tented camps for black Africans. At their peak, it's estimated that 115,000 were interned in the concentration camps. As Kitchener himself put it, the concentration camps were the most effective method of limiting the endurance of the guerrillas. This was the first time in history that such camps were used to pacify an entire nation of people. These camps were produced on a very large scale and were incredibly poorly run. Diseases such as typhoid, measles, and dysentery ran rampant. These diseases were poorly understood at the time, and so basic preventative measures were not taken. Due to the poor living conditions and sanitation, inmates in these camps, and in particular children, were very susceptible to these crippling illnesses. 1 in 4 children that were interned at the camps would die there. Compounding this further, a tiered system for food and shelter allocation was set up. Those who had surrendered were given much more food and slightly better accommodation, but those who had families that were still fighting the British were given much less, and this group of people became known as the undesirables. This was the case for poor Lizzie and her family. The atrocities committed in pursuit of crushing the Boers were brought to the public eye by a woman named Emily Hobhouse. Emily was a prominent welfare advocate, a feminist and a pacifist who had opposed the war since its outset. After setting up the South African Women and Children's Relief Fund, she then travelled and visited these camps with the permission of the British military. Over the course of just a few months, she saw firsthand the treatment of the interned Boers. She delivered her report in June of 1901. It is important to note that Emily was not able to visit any of the black African camps, though, with similar death tolls, the camps were of a similar standard. Her report was very clear that any continuation of these camps was nothing short of the murder of children. Her report in particular described how the children were fed unsuitable and insufficient food that was drooped in the heat. She wrote of many instances of families who had lost multiple children to the camps. She described babies being only a few months old, dying merely hours after she had last seen them. Photographs were taken of the deceased children, so their fathers who were absent still fighting the war would be able to see them one day. The tents in which the Boers lived were of canvas material that trapped in the heat and offered absolutely no protection from the rain. Carpets of flies covered everything. There was no ground sheet, no beds, no furniture. The average provisions that was given to the undesirables was a pound of flour, 2 ounces of sugar, and an ounce of coffee per day. On occasion, they would be given a small helping of meat. Water was limited to 2 buckets for all needs. This water was neither cleaned or boiled. The nurses in the camps were underfed and overworked, with no support from those who had set up the camps. Little to no soap was available, and never enough to clean a child or their clothes. It was only due to the pressure from Emily and her consistent barrage of letters to the London press did matters improve. The government set up their own commission, led by Millicent Fawcett, which only confirmed Emily's findings. Whilst things did improve, the damage had already been done. Emily was never permitted to return to the war zone or the camps. The figures from this war speak for themselves. 22,000 children dead, an estimated 46,000 civilians dead, 26,000 men shipped overseas, and 30,000 farms destroyed. The British Empire did not bother to count the black Africans who died at the forced labour camps, but the figure is thought to be around 20,000. The Boer Republicans were all but wiped from the face of the earth. It was not until 1910 that a new South Africa was formed, and its own troubled history is a story for another day. What cannot be forgotten is the treatment of the civilians. Regardless of the motivations of either side of the conflict, it is hard to justify the treatment of women and children. Whilst intentions at the outset were to offer shelter to the protected burghers, the camps were soon turned into little more than squalid holding pens for hostages. The treatment inflicted upon these people by the British officials and superiors is unforgivable. We should also not forget the determination of Emily, who brought to the world's attention the plight of those in these barbaric concentration camps. This was a woman who fought off snakes with a parasol, and went to war with the British government and the military elite. As a token of appreciation, the South Africans purchased a retirement home for Emily in Cornwall. Even in the 21st century, there are those who seek to downplay the role or sanitize what happened at these camps, such as the one where Elizabeth died, just as the politicians back then insisted that Elizabeth arrived at the camp in the dreadful condition she was photographed in, when in reality, she got into that condition in the 2 months she was there. Finally, we cannot forget Elizabeth and what she represents. Though only one of tens of thousands killed in these inhumane conditions, her photograph endures as a reminder to the potential of man's indifference and disregard for human life.